The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was elbow deep in a deposition file, trying to untangle a commercial lease dispute that had been dragging on for 8 months. My phone buzzed twice on the corner of my desk, then a third time, which meant whoever it was had called back immediately. I don't pick up numbers I don't recognize during work hours. But something made me reach for it anyway. It was a man named Gerald Fitch. He introduced himself as the estate attorney for my grandfather, Raymond Holloway, who had passed away 11 days earlier in Savannah, Georgia. I hadn't spoken to my grandfather in almost 4 years, not because we'd had a falling out, but because distance and busy schedules and the particular kind of silence that grows between people when neither one reaches out first. He was 81. I was 32. We'd run out of easy conversation topics somewhere around the time I passed the bar exam. Gerald didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told me that Raymond had updated his will 14 months ago and that I was the sole named beneficiary. The estate included the main house on Forsyth Street, 2 income properties in the historic district, an investment portfolio, and a cash account. He told me the total value. I made him repeat it. He did. $63 million. I sat down. I hadn't realized I was standing. My chair rolled back 2 inches and I grabbed the edge of my desk to stop it. The deposition file slid onto the floor, and I didn't move to pick it up. The first coherent thought I had wasn't about the properties or the portfolio, it was about my brother. Marcus was 3 years older than me, louder by about 30 decibels, and had been our grandfather's self-appointed favorite for as long as either of us could remember. He called Raymond every Sunday. He flew down to Savannah for the holidays, took up fishing, just because Raymond liked it, wore the same brand of boots. He'd spent a decade building a relationship I'd quietly admired and occasionally resented. And now he wasn't in the will. I told Gerald I needed 24 hours before I said anything official. He said that was fine and gave me his direct line. After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time without moving. The deposition file was still on the floor. Someone knocked on my door and I told them I was on a call. I wasn't. I was trying to figure out how to keep $63 million from detonating inside my family like a grenade with the pin already pulled. My name is Claire. I'm a real estate attorney at a mid-size firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm not the kind of person who makes scenes at family dinners or sends passive-aggressive text messages at midnight. I keep my head down. I do the work. I solve problems with documentation and deadlines, not arguments. Which is exactly why what came next caught me almost completely off guard. I spent that first evening reading through everything Gerald emailed over. The will was clean, specific, and unmistakably intentional. Raymond had not forgotten Marcus. He'd made a separate provision, a personal letter, sealed, to be delivered to Marcus privately. Nothing financial. Just words. Whatever he wanted to say, he'd chosen to say it that way. I called my grandmother the next morning, Raymond's wife of 51 years. She already knew. She'd been there when the will was signed and she'd kept it to herself, which was exactly the kind of quiet loyalty she'd always shown him. She didn't explain why Raymond had made the choices he had. She just said he had his reasons and that they were good ones. Marcus didn't know yet. That part was on me. I flew to Savannah 4 days later to meet with Gerald in person and begin the process of taking inventory. The house on Forsyth Street was older than anything I'd ever owned. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, a back garden that my grandmother had kept for 30 years. Walking through it alone that first morning felt strange. The kind of strange that comes with something being both familiar and completely new at the same time. Gerald met me at the house at 10. He walked me through each property's documentation, explained the portfolio structure, and outlined the timeline for transferring everything into my name. He'd clearly done this 100 times before, and his calm made the whole thing feel more manageable than it had in my head. Before he left, he said something I didn't fully understand until later. He said Raymond had anticipated that this might be complicated and had made certain that the legal structure left no room for dispute. I thanked him and didn't ask what he meant by complicated. I found out 2 days later. I was at a title company going over the income property paperwork when my phone lit up with a call from my mother. I let it go to voicemail, then Marcus called. Then my mother again. I stepped out of the meeting to listen to the voicemails. My mother's voice was careful, measured. She said Marcus had received his letter from Gerald that morning and that he was upset and that she thought it would be a good idea for me to call him soon. Her second voicemail was shorter and less careful. She said Marcus was more than upset. She said he felt blindsided and that we should handle this as a family. I called her back instead of him. She picked up on the first ring. The first thing she said wasn't "How are you?" or "This must be a lot to process." It was that Marcus had been counting on Raymond's estate to help fund a business he'd been developing. A restaurant group. 3 locations, he'd been planning it for 2 years. He'd apparently told Raymond about it. She seemed to think that was relevant. I listened. Then I told her I hadn't asked to be named in the will. She said she knew that. Then she said that maybe there was a way to be generous, that Marcus was family, that Raymond would have wanted the family to be okay. I said I needed to go back into my meeting. She said fine and hung up before I did. Marcus called again that evening. I answered. He didn't yell, which surprised me. He was controlled in the way people get when they're working hard to stay that way. He said he thought there must have been some mistake, that Gerald must have misread something. I told him there was no mistake, that I'd been through the documents myself. He asked if Raymond had said anything to me directly. I told him the honest truth, which was that I hadn't spoken to Raymond in several months before he died. There was a long pause. Then Marcus said quietly that he'd given up a lot of opportunities to be present for Raymond. That he'd passed on a job offer in Boston 4 years ago because he wanted to stay close enough to drive down to Savannah on short notice. He said he thought that counted for something. I told him I was sorry he was in pain. I told him I was still figuring everything out. I told him I'd be in touch. He said okay. He said it the way people say okay when they mean something else entirely. I flew back to Charlotte the next morning. I had client files waiting, a court date on Thursday, and a partner meeting I'd already rescheduled twice. I told myself the situation with Marcus would settle once the shock wore off. People process grief in different ways. Unexpected news takes time to land properly. I was giving him room. What I didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't standing still while I was giving him room. He was moving. I found out from my cousin Deja, who called me on a Saturday morning sounding equal parts nervous and guilty. She said she'd been at a dinner party the week before with some people from the local business community, people I didn't know. And Marcus had been there. She said he'd spent a good part of the evening talking about the estate. He described it as a family inheritance that was currently tied up in legal complications. He'd implied he was actively working to resolve those complications. He'd also mentioned, more than once, that he had deep connections to the properties in Savannah and that he was exploring options for developing them. I thanked Deja. I told her I wasn't upset with her. I meant it. After I hung up, I called Gerald. Gerald already knew. Apparently, one of the people at that dinner party had been a commercial developer who'd reached out to Gerald's office directly. Gerald had been professionally tight-lipped, but he wanted me to be aware. I asked him what our options were. He walked me through them. The estate was already in the process of transferring into my name, but there were steps I needed to take immediately to make it clear that no one else had the authority to represent or negotiate on behalf of those properties. We drafted a formal notice to be sent to all relevant parties. We also put together a simple documentation package, title records, trust verification, the legal structure Raymond had put in place that could be used to quickly correct any misrepresentation. Gerald mentioned, almost as an aside, that this was what Raymond had anticipated, that phrase again. I started to understand it. My grandfather had not been careless. He'd spent 14 months structuring this in a way that left no ambiguity, no gray area, no opening for a claim that could gain traction. He'd done it because he knew his family, he knew Marcus. And he'd known that the letter, whatever it said, wouldn't be enough to stop what was coming. He'd been right. I didn't sleep well that week. I worked late, caught myself going over the same documents twice, and spent more time than I should have thinking about Marcus in Raymond's kitchen on Sunday mornings, doing all the things I hadn't done, and wondering what the letter had said. I wondered if Raymond had explained himself. I wondered if an explanation would have helped. Thursday came and went. The court date was fine. The partner meeting was productive. From the outside, everything looked normal. From the inside, I was building walls I'd never expected to need. The next wave came through my mother, which I should have seen coming. She called on a Wednesday afternoon and asked if I'd thought about Marcus's restaurant project. She said she wasn't taking sides. She said it more than once, which is how I knew she was. She said that Marcus had put real time and energy into this plan and that Raymond had known about it and that maybe that was relevant context. I asked her if Raymond had left Marcus money for the restaurant. She said no, but I said there was no but. The will said what it said. She said that families find ways to take care of each other. I said I agreed. I also said that taking care of someone didn't mean handing over assets I'd been entrusted with to fund a business plan I'd never reviewed. She said I sounded like a lawyer. I said I was one. That conversation ended without resolution and with a chill between us that was new and uncomfortable. My mother and I had always been close, the kind of close where she was my first call after good news and my second call after bad. Feeling that distance open up was harder than I'd expected. I let it sit for 2 days. Then I drove to her house and we sat at her kitchen table and I tried to explain, without the lawyer voice, what I was actually dealing with. I told her that Marcus was representing himself to strangers as having authority over property that wasn't his. I told her that the people he was talking to were developers and investors. I told her that if he made commitments on the basis of those conversations, it could become a legal problem for everyone, including him. She listened. She didn't say much. But by the time I left, the chill had thawed a little. Not gone, but less sharp. My brother, however, was not interested in thawing. I got a call from Gerald the following Monday. A local developer in Savannah, a man named Paul Whitmore, had met with Marcus over the weekend. Marcus had presented him with what he described as preliminary development plans for the Forsyth Street property. He'd described the home as part of an estate currently under family review and said he was one of the decision-makers. Gerald's voice was carefully neutral. He even told me this, the same way it always was, but I could hear the weight underneath it. I asked what Paul Whitmore's interest was. Gerald said he was a well-known developer in the area, legitimate, had done good projects, but was clearly moving fast on this because he thought there was an opportunity before the estate was fully settled. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd simply been given inaccurate information. I told Gerald to send Paul Whitmore the documentation package. I also told him to draft a letter making absolutely clear that Marcus had no authority over any aspect of the estate, the properties, or any decisions related to them. The letter needed to be sent to Marcus directly, formally, so there was a record. Gerald said he'd have it ready by end of day. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. There's something surreal about having to send a legal letter to your own brother, about having to treat family like a liability instead of a given. I hadn't grown up expecting this. Marcus and I had fought growing up the way siblings do, but we'd also driven each other to airports and helped each other move and shown up at each other's low points without being asked. Some part of me was still waiting for that version of him to resurface. He called me the same evening the letter arrived. His voice had changed. The control from our first call was gone. He said I was treating him like an enemy. I said I was protecting assets I was legally responsible for. He said I was hiding behind legal language to avoid having a real conversation. I said the real conversation we needed to have was about why he'd told a developer he was a decision-maker on property that belonged to me. He said he was trying to build something, that he had a vision for that house, for those properties, that would have made Raymond proud. That Raymond had listened to him talk about it for 2 years and never said no. I said not saying no and naming someone as heir were two different things. He said it wasn't fair. I said a lot of things in life aren't fair, and that I was sorry this was one of them, and that I still loved him, but that I couldn't let him make representations on my behalf, that I hadn't authorized and didn't agree with. He hung up. He didn't slam the phone, which somehow made it worse. He just ended the call, quietly, and I sat in my apartment in Charlotte listening to the silence where my brother used to be. The next morning I went for a run before work, something I only do when I'm processing something I can't think through sitting still. I ran further than I usually do. By the time I got back, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for the next surprise. I was going to get ahead of it. I called my childhood friend Renata, who worked in commercial real estate in Atlanta. I asked her to quietly reach out through her network to see what, if anything, was circulating about the Savannah properties. If Marcus was having conversations with developers, there might be more than just Paul Whitmore. Renata called me back 2 days later. There were 2 others. One had received a similar pitch. The other had been shown what Marcus described as a preliminary partnership structure, a document I'd never seen and certainly never signed. I forwarded everything to Gerald. Within 48 hours, he'd sent correction letters to all 3 developers, each one including the title documentation and a clear statement of who held authority over the estate. None of them pushed back. They were business people. They didn't want to be in the middle of a family dispute. They stepped back quietly. What I didn't anticipate was that Marcus had also been talking to people in my professional world. I found out the hard way when a colleague at a firm I'd worked with on a commercial deal 2 years earlier called me out of the blue and asked if everything was okay. He was careful about how he said it. He mentioned that he'd run into someone at a conference who seemed to know a lot about my personal situation. He said the person had suggested I was overwhelmed by the estate and might be looking to partner with someone experienced in property development. That person was my brother. I thanked my colleague. I told him I was not overwhelmed. I told him I had everything under control and that the estate was fully represented by counsel. He said he'd assumed as much and that he just wanted me to know. After I hung up, I sat very still for a moment. Then I called Gerald and told him we needed to talk about next steps. Gerald had been an estate attorney for 30 years. He'd seen family disputes over money his whole career. He laid out the options the way he always did, clearly, without judgment. We could file for a temporary restraining order if Marcus continued misrepresenting himself. We could also document every instance and build toward a civil claim if necessary. Or we could send a final, formal cease and desist that made all of this explicit and on the record. I chose the cease and desist. I chose it because I wanted Marcus to have one more clear line he could see before he crossed it. I still wasn't ready to treat this as a war. I was still, somewhere underneath the documentation and the formal letters and the professional calm, hoping he'd stop. The letter went out on a Thursday. Marcus received it on Friday. He didn't call me, he called our mother. She called me on Saturday morning. Her voice was different this time, not the careful diplomacy from before, something more tired. She said Marcus was devastated. She said the letter had made him feel criminalized. She said she understood that I had rights and obligations, but that she hoped I understood that this was a family. I said I did understand that. I also said that a family was supposed to operate with honesty and that what Marcus had been doing wasn't honest. She didn't argue with that. Instead, she said something I hadn't expected. She said she thought Marcus had genuinely believed Raymond intended for the family to share the estate and that the will had been a shock he hadn't processed the right way. I asked her if she believed that. She paused. Then she said she thought Marcus believed it, which was different from saying she did. That distinction mattered to me. A week passed. Then 2. Marcus didn't call. The developers went quiet. Gerald confirmed that the property transfer was complete, everything in my name, clean and undisputed. Renata checked in and said she wasn't hearing anything new moving through the network. The absence of noise was its own kind of information. I flew back to Savannah on a Friday in October. The air was warm still, hanging on to summer the way it does down there. I drove to the house on Forsyth Street, let myself in with my key, and stood in the front hallway for a while. I walked through each room. The furniture was still Raymond's. His books were on the shelves. His reading chair was positioned the way he'd always kept it, slightly angled toward the window. My grandmother had taken some things to her apartment, but she'd left most of it because she said it felt right to leave it for now. I went out to the back garden and sat on the stone bench near the far wall. The garden was overgrown in places, but the roses my grandmother had planted were still there. I sat with the quiet for a long time. I thought about the question I kept circling, which was whether Raymond had known what this would cost. Whether he'd known that naming me would fracture something in the family that might not fully heal. I thought about the legal structure he'd spent 14 months building, the way he'd accounted for every angle, and I thought that yes, he'd known. And he'd done it anyway. Because he'd trusted me with something that mattered to him, and he'd decided that trust was worth more than the peace of not choosing. That helped. Not completely, but enough. I called my mother from the garden. She picked up on the third ring. I told her I was in Savannah. She asked how the house looked. I told her it looked like Raymond's house. She said that was good. We talked for 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the estate. She asked about a case I'd mentioned months ago. I asked about her knee, which had been giving her trouble. It wasn't perfect, but it was us. Before we hung up, I told her I wasn't angry. At her or at Marcus. I told her I'd made the decisions I had to make and I wanted to come out the other side of this without losing more than I'd already lost. She said she wanted that too. She said she'd talk to Marcus. She didn't promise what that would look like. I said that was okay. I meant it. I flew back to Charlotte on Sunday evening. Monday morning started the way every Monday started: coffee, email, a stack of files that had grown over the weekend. A paralegal knocked on my door to ask about a motion deadline and I gave her the answer and she left, and the day started moving the way days do. A few weeks later, Gerald called to say that Marcus had reached out to his office directly to ask a procedural question about the estate process. Gerald had answered it briefly and professionally. He mentioned it to me as a matter of courtesy, not urgency. There was no new attempt to negotiate, no new developers, no new letters. Just a question. A quiet one. I didn't know what it meant. Maybe Marcus was still working through it in private. Maybe the cease and desist had finally closed a door he needed closed to stop moving. Maybe the letter from Raymond said something that was still settling in him the way grief settles, slowly and without a predictable timeline. I didn't ask. I decided to let the quiet be quiet. The Forsyth Street house is going to need work before I decide what to do with it. There are structural issues Gerald flagged in the inspection, and the garden needs real attention, and I'll need to make decisions about the furniture and what to keep and what to hand back to my grandmother. There's no rush. Raymond built it that way too. He didn't want me scrambling. He wanted me to have time to do this right. I've been thinking a lot about what right means in a situation like this. It doesn't mean being untouched. It doesn't mean coming out of a hard thing without any marks on you. It means looking at what you were given, understanding the weight of it, and deciding to carry it with your eyes open rather than hand it off to someone who would carry it badly. I'm 32 years old. I'm a real estate attorney. I know how to read a document and hold a deadline and protect what's mine. I also know that the hardest part of all of this had nothing to do with titles or trust structures or developer letters. The hardest part was learning that protecting something real sometimes means disappointing the people you love. And that you can do it anyway. And still love them. And still be okay. Raymond knew that. He'd spent 81 years figuring it out. He left me the house and the portfolio and the paperwork trail. But I think what he was really leaving me was the lesson. I think I'm finally starting to understand it.